Anyone who knew John List all reacted the same way, that how could he have done this? Why did he do it?
I felt that even though I killed the family, I could still get forgiveness eventually from God.
I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man.
Bob is John List.
7th December 1971, in Westfield, New Jersey, Christmas was coming up, and winter was about to get really cold. The town's citizens were anticipating the holidays and were in a cheerful mood. On that freezing December night, their joy was overtaken by feelings of utter terror. Locals in Westfield decided to contact the authorities after noticing no activity in or around the Breeznall house, which is home to the devout List family, for a month. 5 out of the 6 List family members' bodies had been brutally slain when the police arrived to investigate the matter. The horrific incident shocked the entire nation. What transpired on that crucial evening? The 6th List family member was who and where? Welcome to Crime Chronicles, where we present some of the most enigmatic crimes in human history. We'll be investigating the case with the craziest twists today. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already before we start. If you enjoyed this, consider liking and subscribing for more. Without further ado, let's begin to examine the case. Westfield, New Jersey, is a traditional community for families today. Renowned for its lovely downtown, top-notch educational system, and easy access to New York City, it provides inhabitants with the benefits of luxurious suburban living and a breathtaking perspective of the city. It provides inhabitants with convenient access to metropolitan New York, as well as the benefits of beautiful suburban living. The town's historic heritage is highlighted by the Victorian and colonial-style homes and the wide, tree-lined streets. The serene setting is home to several leisure amenities for both adults and children, including golf courses and beautiful parks. All people of Westfield are pleased to name the area their home, yet a sickening murder perpetrated in 1971 has left a lasting stain on this small, attractive community. Westfield became the location of the List family's cruel end. September 17, 1925, saw the birth of John Emil List, was the child of Alma and John Frederick List. Both Barbara Florence List and herself were evangelical Lutherans and descended from German immigrants. John was born when his mother was 38 years old and his father was already 66 years old. Born and raised in Bay City, Michigan, John E. List, he also had strong religious and moralistic parents with whom he shared a home, which led to tension in his relationship with them. John's mother was responsible for parenting him because his father had little interest in doing so. Alma List, John's mother, forced him to go to church on a daily basis and forbade him from being unruly. Alma considered it dishonorable to connect with kids or do anything even remotely risky. John was raised in a very rigid and traditional setting, which caused him to become a repressed, neurotic young man, who did not enjoy himself very much among his peers. When John reached the age of 18, he enlisted in the American Army in 1943. John served in both World War II and the Korean War, returning home to work for an accounting firm. A year after his father passed away in 1944, John moved on to become a supervisor at a paper mill. John first met Helen Morris Taylor in 1951 when he was 26 years old. Helen had a daughter named Brenda Joyce Taylor with Marvin Everett Taylor, a military hero who had passed tragically previously in 1951. Within a month of their first meeting, John and Helen became close. They rapidly got married the next year, and Helen's pregnancy worry was later revealed to be unfounded. After their marriage, John also learned of Helen's health problems. After a bit of a rocky beginning, John and Helen were able to work things out. Helen had syphilis from her first husband, but wasn't contagious at the time she married John. On January 8, 1955, they moved to Michigan and had their first child. They gave their newborn daughter the name Patricia Morris List, or just Patty. They later gave birth to a child on October 21, 1956, and named him John Frederick List in honor of his grandfather. However, his loved ones called him John Jr. Helen's dependence on alcohol and antidepressants began on August 26, 1958, the day their third and last child, Frederick Michael List, was born. She even stopped attending church and began to disagree with John's practice of religion.
John, when you go to church this Sunday, I want you to take my name off the membership rolls.
What did you say?
I don't care if you take the kids, you take my name off.
Brenda, Helen's first child, had been pregnant at the age of 16 and had been relocated to a home for unmarried mothers around the same time. John made the decision to relocate to New Jersey and purchase a mansion in the hopes of improving things for his family and keeping them happy. He requested assistance from his mother in order to pay the mansion's mortgage.
Mom, I can't afford it by myself. But with your $10,000, I can make the down payment. Please, Mama, help me.
Alma agreed, but only if she would also move in with them. Alma and Helen didn't agree with each other and didn't like one another, but the prospect of living in a mansion caused them to put aside their disagreements. The List family moved into a 19-room Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey in 1965 at 431 Hillside. Breeze Knoll was its given name. Additionally, John was hired as the vice manager of a nearby bank. The List family appeared to be the model American family from the outside. The family never missed a Sunday service because John List was the Sunday school teacher at the nearby church. John was devoted to upholding his family's reputation in society. Things were finally looking up for the List family for the first time in a while, but their joy was fleeting. The neighbors of the List family became suspicious at the beginning of December in 1971 after not seeing any of them for a month. Additionally, there had been no activity at the mansion or in its vicinity. The family's constant use of the mansion's lights, which had initially led the neighbors to believe they were on vacation, made them suspicious. On Tuesday, December 7th, 1971, they decided to alert the authorities after growing concerned as more questions began to surface.
It's been a month. I've been keeping my eye on this place. One by one, the lights have been going out, and that music doesn't stop.
The main door was locked, and no one was replying when the police came, so a number of officers began to search the mansion. Through a window that was open, they entered the mansion. Church music was playing loudly on the radio, and a vile scent of rotting flesh pervaded the mansion. The temperature inside was almost as low as it was outside. Examining the 19-room mansion's rooms in the ballroom, Officer Charlie Holder discovered something terrible. The remains of 13-year-old Frederick, Patricia, 16, John Jr., 15, and 47-year-old Helen were found laying close to each other on sleeping bags on the ground. Everybody's bodies appeared to have been shot, and their faces were all covered.
He cleaned up a lot of the blood and had bags with bloody towels and rags. That's one thing you never forget. Something like that you never think would happen or you'd come upon, and it stuck with me for a long time.
The List family killings' graphic details matched scenes from a psychological thriller. Officer Charlie Holder alerted the other cops and continued to examine the scene after seeing anything so unsettling for the first time in his career. There were signs of blood leading to the kitchen, where the cops discovered a group of people covered in blood and paper bags filled with bloody towels. Alma List, age 84, was the sixth body discovered in the mansion's attic on the third level. A towel had been placed over her face. The bodies of 5 members of the List family were found by the police, but John List, the sixth, was still missing. In John's room, 2 handguns and a 5-page letter were discovered. The unusual thing about all the family photos they discovered in the residence also caught the police's attention. They shared a characteristic. John's face had been removed from every image. John left no trail behind him, and he was nowhere to be discovered. The detectives came to the conclusion that the victims were killed in the kitchen and their bodies dragged to the ballroom after looking at the blood trail heading there. The authorities began investigating the physical evidence and sending all of the List family members' bodies for autopsies. A 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and a .22 caliber revolver were discovered at the crime scene. The firearms yielded and preserved the killer's fingerprints. The firearm was acquired on October 14, 1971 by John under his name and was a .22 caliber revolver that belonged to John's father. This led the police to believe that John may have been planning this slaughter for a while. At first, they weren't sure if John was a victim or the murderer, but the note discovered in his chamber proved that he had murdered his family. John wrote the letter by himself.
I know what this must look like to you, but I want you to know that I took special care to be sure there was no pain. Well, he and the kids came to church every Sunday. He used to teach Sunday school.
It was dated November 7, 1971, written to Eugene A. Rowinkel, the pastor of the List family. John admitted to killing his own family members in the letter. He also provided the pastor with some relatives and acquaintances' contact information so he could get in touch with them and let them know about the situation. John added that Helen and the children had preferred cremation. John requested in the letter that the pastor make funeral arrangements for his family and keep the costs to a minimum. When the authorities began interviewing the List family's neighbors, they discovered that the family's impeccable reputation was simply a facade. The truth about what happened inside the home created an entirely different image. When the List family first moved into the mansion, the neighbors initially thought of them as the epitome of the perfect American family since they were responsible, moral, and devout. All the neighbors soon came to the conclusion that the List family wasn't as flawless as they had initially believed. The neighbors perceived them as a very decent and devout family, but also discovered that they were antisocial and somewhat strange. For everyone, John E. List in particular stood out. When a neighbor delivered a pie to John to welcome him to the neighborhood, John informed him directly that the List family was rude, but he yet accepted the pie. Everyone in the area thought John was a strange and extremely rude man. Some of the neighbors remembered seeing him mowing the grass on a hot summer day while dressed in a tux. This was seen by many people on numerous times. When John didn't like a t-shirt Patricia was sporting, he ripped it off of her while yelling at her, according to a school buddy who later alerted the police. Patricia thought her father despised her. Similar to this, the cops stopped Patricia one evening as she and a friend were stumbling through the streets after dark. When John was asked to pick her up from the train station, he did so in a way that left his neighbors who were there in shock. John was summoned to the station in the wee hours of the morning. He still put on his tux before departing. However, it was his hostile behavior toward Patricia that astounded the neighbors. When John List objected to Patricia's interest in play, and Iliano, Patricia's drama coach, informed the police that he had met him a few times. He claimed that John had a scary demeanor and exuded evil energy. After a particularly heated confrontation, Patricia had once even revealed to Ed that her father had threatened to kill the entire family. These threats increased in frequency, and occasionally John would even ask his kids if they preferred to be buried or cremated. The detectives realized that John had probably been preparing these killings for a while after learning these details. As the inquiry continued, the police discovered that John had already stopped the delivery of milk, newspapers, and letters. There were no indications that would call attention to the breeze because the List family hadn't been to church since November, and the school had been informed that the family was taking a vacation to care for Helen's ailing mother. Mansion Noel John's automobile was found parked close to the John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York on Thursday, December 9, 1971. The parking ticket was for a Chevy Impala and was dated November 10, 1971. Although there were no records of John taking a flight, the police believed he may have done so and may have fled the country. The only thing the investigators were certain of was that John had a 1-month head start wherever he was at the moment. When the autopsy results were released, it was determined that the gun discovered in John's room at the mansion was used to kill every member of the family. Except for John Jr., everyone has once received a headshot. He received a total of 10 gunshot wounds to the head, neck, and chest. The officers were perplexed by this and questioned why John Jr. endured a worse fate than the other family members. The memorial service was held on November 12, 1971. Alma List was interred in Frankenmuth, Michigan's St. Lawrence Lutheran Cemetery, while Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were buried in Westfield, New Jersey's Fairview Cemetery. There is peace in the eternal valley, read their gravestone. Numerous police officers were stationed at the cemetery on the day of the funeral in the hopes that John would attend, but he never did. Law enforcement gave the case top priority, and they were committed to apprehending John List. Every police station in the nation received a copy of his photo for everyone to view. The years passed, but John's whereabouts remained unknown. The detectives found it difficult to imagine that John had not yet been encountered by a police officer across the nation. There was speculation that John might have committed suicide out of guilt. Despite months of investigation, the police were unable to identify John or find any evidence that would point them in his direction. The murder case involving the List family eventually became unsolved. The initial investigators working on the List family case retired after a number of years, leaving behind New Jersey's most macabre puzzle for replacement detectives. By 1988, Detective Bernard Tracy and Captain Frank Maranka had taken on the case. The investigators who had just been hired used a novel approach to crack the case. America's Most Wanted, which featured cases from all over the nation and had viewers on the edge of their seats, was making headlines in April 1988. The entire nation was enthralled by the John Walsh-hosted program. Maranka and Tracy made the decision to contact the show's creators later in 1988 after considering the show's popularity and audience.
One night watching TV, we watched America's Most Wanted.
If we were successful in getting the List case aired, someone out there would recognize him, would make that telephone call.
The show's makers believed that John List had likely passed away by this point because the case had been unsolved for too long. However, Maranka and Tracy refused to give up. They repeatedly pressed the producers of the show to run an episode about John List, and in April 1989, they finally got their wish.
I said, this is a guy I'd like to see caught, and we decided to do John List.
The investigators collaborated with Frank Bender, a sculptor who had previously collaborated with the police, to assist them in reconstructing the faces of those whose remains had already deteriorated when the police discovered them. Frank only required the body's skull, but this situation was different.
I had been involved in the battle for missing children's rights for years since the murder of my son in 1981, and I had come across Frank Bender over the years as a renowned forensic reconstruction artist.
Frank took the case very seriously because it was the first of its kind. He told the detectives that he wanted to know everything about John before he started making the sculpture. Frank had to create a sculpture of what John would look like now in 1989 using only a picture taken more than 18 years before John.
I get into the head of the person. In a sense, I want to become that person while I'm working on The Fugitive. I want to feel like that person. I want to know everything about that person.
A forensic psychologist was tasked with assisting Frank in creating a psychological profile of John.
The perpetrator has a history of frustration and feeling entrapped by women. Generally women of their own age group or older, or women in authority.
They eventually had time to create a sculpture of what John would have looked like in 1989. However, they weren't certain of one particular aspect. If John had started wearing contacts or not, they questioned. What kind of glasses would he be sporting right now if not? John wouldn't care enough about his appearance, according to the psychologist working on the case, to switch his glasses for lenses. He also proposed the possibility that John had switched spectacles and acquired a pair with thick, black, and worn rims.
To look more intelligent, more important than he really was, and this was through the help of Richard Walter's profile.
Psychologists hypothesized that List would don the same glasses he did when he was younger to serve as a reminder of his earlier, more prosperous days. Finally, the sculpture of John, as he would seem today, was finished. On a May 21st, 1989 show, John Walsh discussed List's case. The primary suspect, John List, was introduced, and all of his background information was provided.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
About 22 million Americans watched the episode, which featured a realistic bust of John's current appearance, in addition to broadcasting his photo across the country. The media also reported on the most current case developments, and word swiftly traveled across the nation. The authorities then received more than 200 tips about John from all throughout the nation, but one stood out. In Denver, Wanda Flannery and her daughter Eva Michelle were watching the America's Most Wanted, John List special. As the episode went on and more information about John List was disclosed, Wanda and Eva saw that Bob Clark, their neighbor, fit John's description remarkably well. His entire resume was identical to John's. Everything started to make sense. Bob was a regular churchgoer, a Lutheran, an accountant with a basic style and well-groomed appearance.
And it just all started adding up, that he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear. He was well put together, classy dresser.
By the time the sculpture was mentioned in the show, and it was revealed to be extraordinarily accurate, Wanda and Eva were certain that their neighbor was in fact John List.
By the time they got to the sculpture, and the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, oh my God, that's Bob, Bob Clark.
Bob is John List.
On June 1st, 1989, just 11 days after the America's Most Wanted segment about John List aired, Wanda called the police and reported her concerns about Bob Clark. She informed them that he and his wife, Dolores Miller, had formerly resided in her neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, but had since relocated to Richmond, West Virginia. The same day, an FBI team led by Agent Kevin August barged into Bob's Richmond office and demanded to know if he was Bob Clark.
I approached him and I asked him, I said, "Are you Mr. Clark?" And he said, "Yes." And then I said, "Are you John List?" And he says, "No, I'm Robert P. Clark."
The authorities were certain that he was lying, and when Bob's fingerprints were compared to those on the gun at the crime scene in 1971, it was established that Bob Clark was actually John List. On June 1st, 1989, John was detained and arrested. The precision of the sculpture startled the authorities. Everything, with the exception of a few more wrinkles, matched John's appearance exactly. He was wearing the identical pair of glasses that the psychologist had selected for the artwork and had anticipated. When John was questioned by the police, he finally disclosed the details of the horrifying incident and how it occurred. Let's now hear the unsettling reality behind the unusual tale. Breeze Knoll's new beginning for the List family was their worst fear. There, their joy was fleeting. John was having trouble by 1971, since his position required him to deal with new trends, a field he lacked expertise in.
I wasn't trained on computers. I was trained to use my brain, not a machine's brain.
He eventually lost his job, but he never informed his family. John believed that his inability to support his family and his poor performance at work made him a failure. He would just get ready in his tux, have breakfast, and act as though he was leaving for work for months, but in reality, he would head to the train station and spend the day there.
He would get dressed up in a suit and drive his car to the train station and take the train a few stops so people thought John List was still viably employed and he was doing well.
He would come home in the evening, tell Helen about his busy day, have supper, and go to bed, only to awaken the next morning and continue to cycle. John's parenting methods also become harsher. John's 3 children received severe penalties for breaking his restrictions.
I've told each and every one of you this house is not a playground. Don't you listen to me anymore? This house is a sanctuary. Off the phone when I'm talking to you. Get off of the phone.
John claimed that Patricia had begun to dress provocatively and that John Jr. had begun to respond angrily. John was troubled by his kids' developing sexuality and sense of independence. John's adolescent children were beginning to act rebelliously, which he found intolerable. He was also struggling to pay the bills and the mansion's mortgage. He went so far as to steal money from his mother's bank account. Helen had also started to ignore her children and started visiting a psychiatrist because her addiction issues weren't getting any better. She even left the church, which increased John's expenses. Any financial restructuring or bankruptcy would damage his family's reputation and tear the family apart, causing his children to drift away from their rigid Lutheran way of life. John was going through a midlife crisis and wasn't sure how to handle it. He decided on the worst course of action instead of telling the truth and seeking for support from his family. John feared that his family was deviating from the path that God had meant them to be on because of modern lifestyles. He thought that if they persisted in living a life of disobedience, they would be confronted by the devil and go to hell. John believed that killing his entire family while they were still innocent would ensure their safe passage to heaven.
I kept thinking about it for several weeks, I'm sure, maybe even a month. My final solution was that if I would kill them, that would save them from any problem.
John implemented his strategy on November 9th, 1971, a Tuesday.
I felt that even though I killed the family, I could still get forgiveness eventually from God. Just got myself so convinced that this was what I had to do that I was going to go through with the whole program.
At the kitchen table near the window, Helen was enjoying her morning coffee around 9 a.m. after the kids had departed for school.
I tried not to act any different than I ordinarily would, so they wouldn't be suspicious.
She was shot at the back of the head by John, who had sneaked up behind her. Helen's jaw was broken and her head was shot through. John carried her body from the kitchen to the ballroom and put it on a sleeping bag as she slowly slid to the ground. John then made his way to his mother's room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. Alma gave John a kiss on the cheek and inquired about the noise. John responded by also shooting her in the head.
She got over and greeted me and gave me a kiss. And she said, "What was that noise?" And I said, "Oh, it must have been some noise out in the back. That's why I came up." And as she got to the doorway, I killed her.
Alma's body was too heavy for John to lift, so he covered her face with a towel and left her in the corridor. Alma wouldn't be able to endure the stress of what he was about to do, therefore he had to murder her even if he didn't really want to. After that, John went to the bank and closed his mother's and his own accounts. He then proceeded to the post office and mailed the letters alerting the kids' schools that the family was going on vacation. John arrived home about 1 o'clock and prepared a sandwich. The phone rang as he awaited the arrival of his kids. Because Patricia wasn't feeling well that afternoon, the school nurse asked John to bring her up. John obliged and drove Patricia home. He entered first, then crept behind the door. He opened fire on Patricia as soon as she entered the room and shut the door behind her. John then laid Patricia's body in the ballroom next to Helen's. Frederick was next, and he suffered the same fate as his mother and sister. Frederick was also shot when he entered the kitchen after returning from school. In the ballroom, John dragged his body and put it on a sleeping bag. Regarding John Jr., things were very different. John List made the decision to drive to his eldest son's football game to support him and see him play because John Jr. had a game that day and would be home late.
So I went over and watched the soccer game. He seemed to be playing a good game and enjoying himself. And then we came home together in the car.
John drove John Jr. home after the game and attempted to shoot him, but he resisted and was hit in the neck. He still lived. John blasted 9 more bullets into his son's torso to relieve the pain because he couldn't stand to see him in discomfort.
All the others, they just dropped. So I knew they were dead. With John, I don't know whether it was a muscle reaction that caused him to jerk around a little bit, but then I shot several more times.
And then everything ended abruptly. John then made an effort to tidy up the crime scene. He saw to it that every body but Alma's was in the ballroom, lying in sleeping bags.
I think after I had shot John and cleaned up, I felt such a measure of relief that this plot that I had was carried out without being interrupted. I more or less relaxed after that.
Around 7 o'clock, John fixed himself some dinner, said a few hymn book prayers for his family, and then went to bed.
Having been in combat, we were out killing and fighting, and then we'd come in and have something to eat. I think that's what allowed me to eat peacefully in the room that I had killed my family.
John felt as though he had actually done his family a favor. He believed that by killing himself, he would be prevented from joining his family in heaven, so he prepared his getaway.
I felt that if you committed suicide, you would automatically go to hell.
On November 10, 1971, John dressed up and prepared to flee the following morning. He turned down the thermostat all the way so that it was below freezing inside. He turned on all the lights and put the radio all the way up to church music. He took this action to deter any invaders.
I felt that if some intruder wanted to get into the house, that they might back off if they've heard music and thought that people were in the house.
John then proceeded to JFK International Airport in his vehicle. With the $2,000 he had, he left his car there and boarded a train towards Denver, Colorado. At that point, Bob Clark appeared and John List vanished. When John arrived in Denver, he used the fictitious name Bob Clark. He began his career as a fry cook and kept a modest profile. John List finally returned to his previous life after things calmed down and the authorities were not after him. He obtained employment as an accountant and resumed his church attendance. He married Dolores Miller, whom he had met at the church in 1985, and they made their home together in a neighborhood in Denver. The disease that killed John's first wife was revealed to Dolores. Before the day of reckoning in 1989, Dolores believed him and fell in love with him, not realizing that he was a mass murderer. John List initially maintained his innocence and claimed to be Bob Clark following his arrest, but while he was being held, a prison guard overheard him confessing to Dolores his misdeeds. The guard told his superiors about the encounter, and John's trial got underway. The defense attempted to claim that John was mentally unstable and was experiencing PTSD as a result of his time in the military, but the prosecution was having none of it. They maintained that John should be held entirely responsible for his acts, despite the fact that he was only experiencing a midlife crisis. Even a psychologist claimed that John was rational when executing the horrific crime.
He made very elaborate plans to carry out the killings in a serial fashion. He did not want two of the family members to be present at the same time.
John Emil List was found guilty of 5 counts of murder in May 1990 after the court was persuaded by the prosecution, and he was given a life sentence without the possibility of release. John recounted his actions and made a final remark while remaining dispassionate and detached.
Sorry for the tragedy that happened in 1971. I feel that due to my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened.
John was then transferred to Trenton's New Jersey State Prison. It also found out that John himself was a fan of the program America's Most Wanted prior to the airing of his episode. He had always hoped there would be an episode about him, and at last there was. The following and final 18 years of John's life were spent in Trenton's New Jersey State Prison. On March 21, 2008, at the St. Francis Medical Center, he ultimately passed away from pneumonia-related complications. He was 82 years old at the time. John never expressed regret for his deeds until he was about to die. The opportunities taken away from Alma, Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick to live their lives to the fullest. Outside of them with their mother keeping an eye on them, the kids are now sleeping peacefully. When Dolores Miller, John's second wife, discovered his true identity, she was really astonished. She was unable to accept that the man she cherished so deeply was a murderer. Her emotional response to the incident left her in denial.
I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man.
Several months after the deaths, the mansion in New Jersey where John List resided with his family caught fire. Years later, a new house was constructed on the property after authorities were unable to determine what caused the fire. Residents of Westfield are still troubled by the remembrance of the murders. In an interview with a reporter in New Jersey in 2008, parents claimed that their kids wouldn't go near that property or even want to live there. Do you believe that John's upbringing in a very religious and disciplined environment contributed to who he became as an adult? Do you believe John would have escaped for good if the sculpture had been inaccurate? Share your opinions with us in the comment area. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Stay careful, and thanks for watching until the next time.